Today we start our story in France before moving on to the USA and Scotland. So sit back as we go to the second half of the 19th century. Eugène Marie Chantrey was born in Nantes, France in 1834. His father was a wealthy shipowner and Eugène had a privileged upbringing. He lived in a fine house and went to the best schools, where his teachers considered him to be a very bright student. He excelled at languages, and when he finished, Eugène went on to study medicine at the University of Nantes. Here his lecturers were very impressed by his attitude towards his studies and his desire to learn. But things were changing in France. The financial crisis of 1846, coupled with the bad harvests, led to an economic depression, and in 1848 there was a revolution which changed the country, and the French Second Republic was formed, led by Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, better known as Napoleon III. Eugène was very influenced by these events, and as he grew into a young man, he became very interested in politics and social justice. He abandoned his studies and in 1851 went to Paris, where he joined fellow Republicans who on the 2nd of December fought against the president's coup d'etat. They were trying to stop the dissolvement of the French National Assembly and the re-establishment of the French Empire. However, they were unsuccessful and Napoleon III was able to implement his reform programs. Eugène briefly returned to study medicine and attended university in both Strasbourg and Paris, but he had changed and he no longer approached his studies in the enthusiastic manner he once did. He felt unhappy and unsettled. He also felt discouraged by the country's political situation, especially when in 1852 Napoleon III had been given the title Emperor of France. Frustrated and disillusioned, Eugène left university without completing his studies. He also left France and boarded a ship bound for America. He liked America. He liked that he was free to express his political views. And he was impressed that it was not only wealthy land-owning gentlemen that could vote, but he missed Europe. So in 1862 he returned. France, however, was still being ruled by Napoleon III, so he decided to settle in England. As he was a gifted linguist, Eugène found work as a French teacher, first in the city of Leicester, before taking up a position in Newcastle. In 1866, he was asked to fill a vacancy in the Scottish capital city of Edinburgh. He liked Edinburgh, especially the architecture and the atmosphere. He also liked the fact that when he looked up, he could always see the historic fortress of Edinburgh Castle that dominated the skyline from its position on Castle Rock. Eugène would parade around the city in arrogant splendour. Always immaculately dressed, he was confident and self-assured and was considered a respectable and cultured gentleman. He not only taught French, he also wrote textbooks on the subject and gave lectures to teachers at some of the leading educational establishments in the city. His command of the German language was also very impressive, and in order to enhance his reputation, he studied Latin and Greek. Eugène found teaching at one location very restrictive, so started to offer his services to different private schools, many of which were very pleased to have a renowned French teacher give classes at their schools. One such establishment was the Newington Academy for Girls, and it was here that Eugène Chantrey became acquainted with a student named Elizabeth Cullen Dyer. Elizabeth was a very pretty and popular pupil, and although he was her teacher, the two of them would meet whenever they could. Eugène may have given the appearance of a well-educated, respectable man, but this image didn't reflect his true character. Shortly after he had arrived in Edinburgh, a young lady named Lucy Home called at his home in George Street in response to an advertisement he had placed for a housekeeper. It was New Year's Day 1867, and Eugène offered her a glass of wine, which she declined, but after he insisted, she took the glass. 2 months later, she discovered that she was pregnant. She wrote to him and explained her predicament, but she never received a reply and was left to bring up her child alone. Somewhat inevitably, Elizabeth Dyer soon found herself in the same situation, young, unmarried, and pregnant. And again, Eugene had no desire to marry her. Elizabeth's father, however, was not going to let his daughter's French teacher bring shame on his family, and insisted that Eugene do the honourable thing and marry his daughter, fearful that any scandal could ruin his standing in the community, which would lead him to be forced to resign his position without any references. Eugene agreed to marry Elizabeth, and on the 11th of August, 1868, Eugene Chantrey and Elizabeth Dyer were married. 2 months later, she gave birth to their first child. Eugene was an uncaring and abusive husband. He would often threaten his wife and was constantly unfaithful to her. He would also drink and become violent. Despite this, a second child was born, followed by a third. Elizabeth, however, had become a withdrawn and sullen person. She left her husband on several occasions, but each time she went back to him. She was aware that at the time, a divorced woman was looked down on, and life would be more difficult for her children. But Eugene's behaviour didn't change. He seemed to loathe his wife, and each time she returned, he got more abusive. He next threatened her with a pistol, and she was forced to seek assistance from the police. He then threatened to poison her, and said no one would know it was him, as he had methods that cannot be traced by doctors. Elizabeth became pregnant again, and gave birth to her fourth child. But her life had become miserable. She was once a smart, clever and charming young lady, but after 10 years of marriage, she felt a very different woman, one that was condemned to a life with an uncaring and abusive husband. Eventually, she did visit a lawyer to discuss divorcing Eugene, but in the Victorian era, divorce was extremely expensive. It would also mean her husband keeping any property and wealth they had accumulated. Elizabeth realised that with 4 children, a divorce was neither economically or socially practical. As time passed, Eugene's drunken, abusive and immoral behaviour was no longer restricted to the confines of his marital home, and his professional work started to suffer. He would go into the city and visit the brothels on Clyde Street, where he was known to occasionally shoot out of the windows, putting fear into the working girls and their customers. Many of the fine gentlemen of Edinburgh who ran the educational establishments were getting concerned about Eugene Marie Chantrey. They questioned his actions and his erratic behaviour. They began to offer him less work. His income declined, and as he refused to change his lifestyle, he soon got into debt and financial difficulty. Eugene had threatened his wife so often during their marriage, but Elizabeth had become accustomed to it, and although he was violent and unpredictable, she had never felt that he would actually carry out his threats. But something had changed. He was quieter and started paying her less attention. He was still volatile and sometimes despondent, but she felt that he was planning something. In October 1877, he took out a life insurance policy on her for £1,000, which covered her accidental death. He was particular to find out exactly what accidental death meant and what was and was not covered. For the first time, Elizabeth now feared that something may happen to her and confided in her mother. She told her that she had not consented to the insurance, but was powerless to do anything. Christmas Day came and went, and Elizabeth had been in excellent health, but on New Year's Day, 1878, she started to feel unwell. It was exactly 11 years to the day since young Lucy Holm had visited the house after applying for a domestic position, and 9 months later gave birth to Eugene's child. Elizabeth decided to go to bed, and at 10 o'clock that night, the family maid came to her room to see if her mistress was feeling any better. Elizabeth asked her to pour her a glass of lemonade. The maid obliged, and then left her mistress in bed. She also made sure the gas fire was burning, as it was January and very cold. The next morning at around 6:30, The maid got up. She could hear a faint moaning sound coming from her mistress's bedroom. She went to see what the matter was, and seeing the door was slightly ajar, she pushed it open. There in front of her was Elizabeth. She was semi-conscious and in much pain. The maid noticed that the gas fire was no longer burning. She immediately went to tell her master that the mistress was not at all well. They both rushed to the bedroom, but Elizabeth was no longer making any noise and seemed to have lapsed into a state of unconsciousness. Eugene thought he heard the baby crying, so sent the maid to investigate. When she returned, he had opened a window and asked her if she could smell gas. The maid replied that she could not, but a few moments later, there was a distinct smell of gas in the room, so she shut off the supply. Eugene rushed off to fetch a doctor. He explained that he thought his wife had been poisoned by a gas leak, and the local doctor, named Dr. Carmichael, accompanied him back to the house. Dr. Carmichael examined Elizabeth and sent word to the city medical officer, named Dr. Littlejohn, to come and look at the patient. Dr. Littlejohn was not convinced that Elizabeth was suffering from the symptoms of having been poisoned by gas, and insisted that she be taken to the Royal Infirmary, where she could be looked at by the eminent Professor McLagan. After a careful examination, Professor McLagan was of the opinion that the patient's symptoms were more comparable to those of someone who had been poisoned, rather than someone who had inhaled a significant amount of gas. He noted that throughout the examination, the patient was unconscious. Word had been sent to Elizabeth's mother, who immediately made her way to the hospital. She sat by her daughter's bedside until in the afternoon of the 2nd of January 1878, when Elizabeth died without ever having regained consciousness. A post-mortem was ordered, which was conducted by Professor McLagan and Dr. Littlejohn, but it failed to determine the cause of death. There was no smell of gas during the post-mortem, and Professor McLagan had noticed that when he had been examining the patient before she died, there was no smell of gas on her breath, but there was also no sign of any other type of poisoning, and all the tests they carried out produced negative results. Eugene had always threatened to poison his wife with something that left no trace, and he may have managed to do it. The time he spent at medical school may have served him for the wrong reasons. With his wife deceased, he would now be able to claim on her life insurance policy and clear his debts. However, Eugene had failed to notice that sometime in the early hours of January the 2nd, his wife had been sick, and this was noticed by Dr. Carmichael, the first doctor to arrive at the scene. He asked the maid if she would bring him the bed sheets and the nightdress so tests could be run. The items were then sent for analysis, which revealed that the vomit stain contained a high level of opium, proof that Elizabeth had been poisoned. Eugene Marie Chantre was arrested, but he denied all the accusations made against him. The detective who had been investigating his case put to him that he had threatened his wife on many occasions, was in debt, and that chemist records showed that he had purchased a large quantity of opium, which had now disappeared. Eugene, however, told the police that he had not mistreated his wife or ever bore any ill feeling towards her. The police considered that they had enough evidence and charged Eugene with the murder of his wife. The trial opened on the morning of Tuesday the 7th of May, 1878. A large queue of people formed outside the courthouse, hoping to be able to get inside to witness the proceedings. When the judge asked Eugene how he pleaded, he replied in a confident tone, "Not guilty." The prosecution told the court that the defendant had killed his wife in order to claim a £1,000 insurance payment. This was money he needed, as his personal finances were not in a very good way. They produced witnesses, including Barbara Kay, the mistress of the Clyde Street brothel. All the witnesses painted a poor picture of the defendant and confirmed how over their 10-year marriage, Eugene had treated Elizabeth very badly and on several occasions had threatened to kill her with an untraceable poison, something the prosecution claimed that he may have learnt about during the years he had spent at medical school. They described the deceased as a cheerful person who was in very good spirits over the Christmas and New Year celebrations, and that she had died from opium poisoning, opium that was purchased by her husband. Although the police had found some evidence of a defective gas pipe in the property, it looked as though the slight crack had been caused deliberately, and the prosecution reminded the courts that the maid had smelt no gas when she first entered the bedroom of her mistress. The prosecution told the jury that the defendant had come to dislike his wife, and the terrible circumstances he had found himself in, with his income diminished and his debts mounting, gave him the unmistakable motive to commit the crime. The defence, however, did not dispute that the deceased may have died from opium poisoning, but informed the court that there was absolutely no evidence that suggested the poison had been administered by the defendant. As the trial proceeded, the press reported it daily. The interest from the public intensified, and it seemed that the whole of Edinburgh was talking about it. The trial lasted for 4 days, and on the afternoon of Friday the 10th of May, the jury retired to consider their verdict. They deliberated for an hour and 10 minutes before returning to the court. When the judge asked the jury foreman if they found the defendant guilty or not guilty, the foreman replied, "Guilty." There was a sigh in the court, and the judge sentenced Eugene Marie Chantre to death. News of the verdict was greeted by cheers by the large crowd that had gathered in Parliament Square, and the next day it was front-page news across Scotland. His defence team appealed the sentence, saying it was based purely on circumstantial evidence, but after careful consideration, the sentence was upheld. From his prison cell, Eugene continued to protest his innocence. He maintained that the stains on his wife's nightclothes and bedsheets were put there to incriminate him, although he could not say by whom. Some public opinion started to move in his favour, and a petition was sent to the Home Secretary, stating that the evidence at the trial had been circumstantial. The newspaper The Scotsman published details of meetings being arranged to protest at the sentence given to Eugene. Despite all his efforts to convince the courts and the public that he was innocent, Eugene Marie Chantre was hanged at Carlton Prison on the 31st of May, 1878. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case.